me, Kelsey?
Nope.
Okay. So with that, I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. Kelly Siman. She's a great friend of mine. While she's not contributing to the labor shortage by helping me send off people to Antarctica, uh, she's been a cargo pilot, explorer, science communicator, many other things. So she's a research fellow at the National University of Singapore Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. And she researches policy, regulations, and social justice issues associated with wicked problems. Yep. In the ASEAN and Pacific regions, she's got a PhD in integrated biosciences from the University of Akron, where she was the Coastal Resiliency and Innovation Fellow. She's got degrees from Virginia Tech and Embry-Riddle, and she has a pilot's license. She also got a Congressional Medal of Antarctic Service for her work at the South Pole. And then, like I said, she volunteers to science communication and is passionate about mentoring women and girls in STEM. So with that, thanks a lot, Kelly, who's going to talk to us about the history of the future.
Thanks, Vic. And yes, I do feel slightly bad, but not really, that I have contributed to your labor shortage with getting one of your mentees to the South Pole. Sorry, but also not sorry, because he's great. So with that, I'm going to talk about the history of our futures. And it's going to be a little bit of a wild ride. But good morning, hello, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are from joining us. I'm Dr. Kelly Siman from the National University of Singapore's Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. Geographically, however, my closest NASA center is Glen in Northeast Ohio, and that's also where I met Vic and where I did my PhD in integrated biosciences and in biomimetics just down the road in Akron. So I'm aware that going through the Big Bang to present day and solving the world's wicked problems might be a little bit of a difficult lift for us to accomplish in just a short hour. But at times, and it might seem like a bit of a wild ride, and like, where is she going with this? But my aim is to weave some intersectionalities and provide some new ways of thinking and viewing our collective cross-scale and collective challenges by bringing us along on this very, really interesting ride. And so additionally, we're also going to talk about some social science and leadership research and what it says about some core components and characteristics needed for creativity and innovation. So with that, Vic mentioned you might be very familiar with this. So Big Bang, here we go. We're going to go all the way through very, very quickly. And at this very, very, very small edge, it was the epoch of the Holocene. And it's 3.8 billion years where all of life pretty much started. But the Holocene is a very, very interesting period or epoch in time, because ostensibly, this is the period which characterizes all of our stable climate, right? Sometimes people think about it as the Flandrian interglacial period, which is characterized by a very quick sea level rise. And this coincides pretty much in line with the exact same time frame of the Holocene. So if you hear something about the Flandrian period or the Holocene, it's roughly about the same time. This is how I remember it. There might be some Simpsons references throughout this. It's just how I remember things. But the Holocene has been an absolutely critical epoch in human development and technology and innovation. Why? Ostensibly, it's because the rapid proliferation and growth and impacts of human species worldwide, including all of our written history, technological advancements and revolutions, development of major civilizations, and overall significant transition towards our urban, stable life in the present. It's all been because of a relatively stable climate from 10 to 12,000 years ago, or 12 to 10,000 years ago. And now that we could actually settle our societies, we really started to harness the energy that would help us build this growth. And by build this growth, it means create a stable society in localized places instead of being hunter-gatherers and being transitionary. And so We have the Industrial Revolution, which started around mid-1800s, largely thanks to harnessing the fossil fuels. And what does this mean really, right? So we have a relatively stable climate for 12 to 10,000 years. Society has started to actually, entrench itself and become stable and entrenched in particular places and localized. And it's actually when we discovered the fossil fuels or the power of the fossil fuels, we really accelerated that growth. And that growth went from the first instances. Vic, is there background noise?
No, clear to me.
Okay, sorry, someone was, okay, thank you. Okay, so the first instance of thick fog, it started to appear with more and more factories, right? So you've heard of the term smog. The term smog comes from Dr. Antoine Devois in 1905, a paper from one of the very first public health and public policy conferences in 1905, and it was very prolific in some areas. They just assumed that they would just dilute up into the air, and up it goes, no problem. So the power of fossil fuels actually to accelerate our economies was clearly starting to become recognized. And we can see in 1905, we already have first instances of masks for public health. World War I, World War II kicked up the beginning of modern mechanized warfare, which caused global oil demand to skyrocket. This is a B-24 Liberator bomber. It's hitting oil refineries in Libya and southern Italy during World War II. This is Operation Tidal Wave, which is during the Allied oil campaign of World War II, because they knew the strategic importance of these repositories. And so as we knew that it would develop and advance our civilizations, we also, that we had mechanized warfare, we understood the strategic importance of these fossil fuels. And then we have the nuclear bomb. This put an end to World War II. We have two bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We'll come back to this soon. But also, fun fact, sort of, but the Tongan volcano from a few weeks ago was the power equivalent of about 100 Hiroshimas. So as we think about this as ending an actual world war, we have the Tongan volcanoes that was about 100 times that. So we've got Winston Churchill. So post-World War II, we began the Marshall Plan and the Great Acceleration, huge, absolutely massive technological advancements. So think plastics, chemicals, nuclear energy, all built on fossil fuels. And Winston Churchill, as I think typically as the narrative goes, we think of him as the absolute hero of World War II. And post-World War Britain, as public health and scientists and the meteorologists were all raising the alarm, because ultimately, Winston Churchill wanted to maintain the illusion that everything was fantastic, everything was great, we're all still rebuilding, nothing to worry about from World War II, doesn't matter. But this was really bad for public health. So he just said, keep burning all the fossil fuels. And so it was all about having this prevailing that from post-war that, Britons will succeed. And he went against the warnings of scientists, which we're going to see as a little bit of a theme. And he was all, don't worry, everything is fine. Nothing to worry about here. We're just going to maintain the complete illusion that everything is fine, no problem. But during this time, when he was pushing forth the burning of these fossil fuels, 12,000 were killed. 12,000 people were killed as a result of three-day, quote, great smog. And these smog masks became a fashion staple a bit, but the health effects still persist genetically in the offspring of people today from their ancestors that experienced this. So because he rebuked science, he was actually partly seen as senile, with lots of stuff going on in the background, like impeachment, and even Queen Elizabeth tried to have him replaced. And this isn't unlike something that we've seen recently. So we've seen this recently play out with a political leader that wants to display appearances of strength and power, despite of what the scientists are actually reporting. So we've seen this in the past. This isn't a new thing. An interesting perspective is that 10 Downing Street. So this is where the UK Prime Minister lives. The Great Smog Event was the most significant incident in the UK in terms of its effect on environmental research, government regulation, and public awareness, and the relationship between air quality and health. And in 1956, the Clean Air Act introduced smoke control areas. But what was particularly interesting about this, so this is a path dependency that we're talking about, is that the reason that 10 Downing Street is black, it's not because it was actually black. It was because there was so much soot and coal from Churchill's time in office that when the Marshall Plan and the great acceleration and the cleanup of Britain actually occurred, they went to clean all the buildings and they found that it was yellow. And then people had an uproar because they weren't used to seeing it in that particular color. And so because of this smog, the Great Smog, we now have a black 10 Downing Street. So we have, just even the colors of things can be because of certain events that have happened in history. So 1967, we still continue to burn loads of fossil fuels for the sake of the economy, because that is what our foundation and our core is built on. It's what our development is built on. And especially with types of the air or rivers, anything will just dissipate and wash it away. Or at least that's purported for what people have said. I'm from Northeast Ohio, and so I have to reference the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, as we all know and love to reference. But this did spur the U.S. Clean Water Act and the EPA. And this was, interestingly enough, during Nixon's time. So Nixon, the Republican, actually started the EPA. But at the same time, people were like, oh my gosh, this is totally trashing the environment. How can water catch on fire? And it was completely the start of the modern day environmental movement in the US. So it was that, and coinciding with Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, which is a really important legacy. Even though, there's a new public awareness that nature was vulnerable to human intervention. But interestingly, at the same time, because there was so much growth and acceleration with these fossil fuel companies, the fossil fuel companies were all starting to actually do their own research. And their own research, they were starting to look at, and I'm going to pick on Exxon a little bit. Exxon was a little bit like one of the first fossil fuel companies to study and start to understand the effects of what their businesses was doing to the environment. But more than that, more than just understanding, they actually buried the results. And those of us in climate science and that are aware of the disinformation campaign, it's actually not a new thing. It's not a new thing, and it didn't start with the actual climate change, because what the fossil fuel industry did was they took a cue from the tobacco industry. So the tobacco industry actually hired the exact same lawyers and marketing agencies as Philip Morris. And what I find funny is, not funny, really, haha, but interesting is on the right, if you see, taste isn't the only reason I smoke. People are always telling me that smoking causes low birth weight. Talk about a win-win-win. An easy labor, a slim baby, and full flavor Winston's, whilst she's holding a martini, it looks like. So this is a complete disinformation campaign that started with Philip Morris, but actually is now going into climate change. And it's not just with tobacco and climate. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was a really prolific book that aimed at the chemical industry. And they were also met with a lot of resistance. That was also met with a lot of resistance, also by the same marketing agencies. With a campaign that said DDT is good for me, with a jingle even that came with it, that DDT is good for me. And so this isn't unlike something that we're seeing play out in real time at this point, right? So, Northeast Ohio, here we have Sherry Tenpenny, a doctor. She's from Northeast Ohio, and this was a talk to the Ohio State Senate, and she was talking about how vaccines cause magnetization and people to, get 5G. So the political denial and disinformation campaigns have happened in the past, and they're going to continue. And it's all along the same particular playbook. And especially with something as lucrative as fossil fuels, or even earth-ending meteorites, as we've seen, or maybe some of you have seen from what I call a documentary, the latest documentary. So why is this backstory important? So learning from the history of how we can actually understand things and recognize the patterns as they roll out in present day and in our future, especially if the policies and our deeply entrenched or long-term plans are established and put in motion. These are path dependencies. And pretty much it's always about the money. It's always, where does it, not always, but it's largely, where does the money come from? If there's resistance, need to be aware and understand any type of intersectionalities of where the money comes from, because anytime behind major policies, especially those that have huge environmental regulations and global impact that could affect an entire industry's bottom line, there's going to be a resistance. And it's important to understand as you assess and think about these policies. So let's move on to 1972. The charts are going to be a little bit fuzzy because it's from 1972 and it's from the Club of Rome. Doesn't matter, just look at the lines, it's all good. And this is the first time really that we've understood, or we've started to assess that, wait a minute, there's actually some limitations to us just having unchecked growth, right? So the internal research on the effects of the business in Western nations, we're starting to consider the problems of unchecked development. But developing nations, at the same time, regarded development through the use of fossil fuels as essential to raise the standards of living for their people. So this is where the inequities of development are starting to become apparent. So 60s and 70s were definitely when environmentalism and sustainability were really starting to sink into the collective consciousness. That's when it hit mainstream. So from the burning rivers making the cover of Time to economist E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful and Ehrlich's Population Bomb, all of these things really started to come to the forefront at this particular time. And at the same time, now we have the start of the 1972 Stockholm Conference. So the UNEP, UN Environmental Program, was born. And from this conference, two things of prominence to note here. One, transnational organizations identified the need for nation states to work cooperatively to solve environmental issues on a global scale. So this is coming as a collective coordination. This is significant, as we'll see. There'll be continuing tensions that rise and shape political discourse of trying to collectively solve these challenges. While two, although science and policy was pretty much started to become more entwined in the world wars, especially because scientists were seen as so prolific in advancing the technology of the war. But environmentally, it was still a little bit bifurcated. And so at the international scale, environmental concerns moved from a purely scientific endeavor into the political realm more and more. And so really, there's one of very few very first international climate change conferences occurred. And this was essentially like a standard scientific conference. Presentations, plenary sessions. There are 4 working groups enumerated here, and there were actually three of these conferences. And from this, we have the World Climate Conference program and the IPCC. So changing climate development, rising inequalities, and the coming together of science and policy in the environmental realm. So in particular, we hit 1973-79, mostly in the Western world, because not everywhere. So we have to acknowledge that. We faced a massive gas and oil shortage. 1979, so Jimmy Carter, in his infamous State of the Union address, turned down the thermostat, put on his sweater, and made 1980 the year of energy conservation. Now, politically, we have to see what's happening and who gets elected around the world, right? So even though this was the year of energy conservation, what happened in 1980 in the next political cycle? Well, so we have Reagan and Thatcher. So we started to see the actual inequalities really starting to happen. The World Bank expanded its role to address some of these developing nations and the rising inequality. But while we have 1980, the year of energy conservation, both Reagan and Thatcher were elected, right? So they came online. So this basically means neoliberalism in a nutshell, free market labor, capitalism, basically deregulation, increased privatization, free trade, austerity measures, which some of you may be familiar with as being in a government agency. That basically means the reduction of a government's budget. And interestingly, Reagan's very, very first act in office, very first act in 1980, keep in mind, Carter, Year of Energy Conservation, his very first act was to issue an executive order that removed all remaining federal controls on domestic production and distribution of oil and gas. So it was the pure deregulation of oil and gas industry. So at the same time, just bear in mind, the Cold War was also escalating for decades. And it was culminating at the peak around 1979 to 1985, so about mid 80s, resulting in a drastically sharp increase in tension and hostility between the Soviet Union and the West. And so we've got Reagan and Thatcher that were pro oil and gas industry, and the Soviet Union's main money, it doesn't come from vodka and borscht, it comes from oligarchs and money, oil and natural gas, right? And so that's where the political power and influence comes from, and concentrated in those particular sectors. And so there's really no incentive for the fossil fuel industry to say, okay, we don't need to really kind of, even though we've been researching this, our fossil fuels, we don't really need to make this public because, politically, the majority of the nation's power or the world's powers are behind us. So as the scientists and public were really starting to become aware of these environmental issues related to public health, politically, there wasn't much of an incentive to do anything about it. And pick on Exxon again, was especially like, not a worry, because we have one of our favorite people in office at the moment, and we're pushing free trade globally and with Thatcher, and there's nothing to worry about. So at the time of this writing in 1982, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was about 340 parts per million. Today it's about 420-ish, 420 parts per million. But they predicted that greenhouse gases and climate change could be detected, by either 1995 or 2020. They're a little bit ahead of their time. And again, ExxonMobil CEO in 1981, with the world going like, wait a minute, what about climate change and what about like the environmental implications and inequities? But at the time, the ExxonMobil CEO said, quote, "It's just our American penchant for exaggerated language." And so there was already this penchant for downplaying the science. And so, okay, this is 1982. I just want you to think, potentially, did this actually come out in 1982? No, it was leaked in 2015. So this was actually a leaked report in 2015. So it did not come out, and we did not know about this, at least publicly, for quite a while. So 83, because of the 1972 Stockholm conference mentioned earlier, loads of global environmental agencies were like, wait a minute, everything's getting worse, even though we're acknowledging these issues and the inequities. So the head of the UN at the time appointed Gro Harlem Brundtland. She's pretty amazing. She is partly responsible for the global free trade. The Brundtland report was partly responsible to global free trade and the rising inequalities, but she was the prime minister to Norway 3 different times, and also the first female PM of Norway, and she went to continue her career in the WHO, and ended as the career for the UN Special Envoy for Climate Change. But what the actual Brundtland report did and said, so we've heard the term sustainable development. This is where it comes from. It comes from the Brundtland report, or colloquially termed our common future. So for the first time, the environment was placed onto the political agenda at the transnational scale, focusing on sustainable development. And it built off the 1972 Stockholm Conference. And again, this was in response to rising tensions, neoliberal globalization, and free trade, and accelerating loss of biodiversity and increased environmental degradation. So we have 1988, IPCC was born. Fantastic. We're pretty much all aware of that, because it plays such an integral part of our science coming out. And so at the same time, so 1988, IPCC came out. But in 1988, also, Shell released its own internal memo. Privately, these companies did not dispute the links between their products, global warming, and the ecological calamity. Like, there's no dispute. And it's actually on the contrary. It actually confirmed the connections. This report actually said that carbon dioxide could double by 2030, and it predicted, or at least, stated that the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is the Thwaites Glacier, also known as the Doomsday Glacier, which is getting quite a bit of press these days, could result in 5 to 6 meters of sea level rise. At a minimum, though, it would be 1 meter. But, quote, it would also have total collapse of biodiversity and ecosystems. Did this come out in 1988? No. This one came out and was leaked in 2018. And so, these reports, the fossil fuel companies didn't dispute any of the science. And what's interesting for me on this report, you can read the entire report, but the one thing that came out for me is they were actually, behind a lot of the initial reduce, reuse, recycle campaigns, shifting the burden away from the individual, or from the systemic change, and onto the individual consumer. So this is the main push of Shell's report that came out. So even though, I have my own reusable straws, I recycle, I do all that stuff, but I'm very well aware of where it actually came from. And it's shifting the burden onto the individual consumer rather than a systemic change. It would be the same thing as the Crying Indian campaign in the 1970s, which was from the packaging industry. And that was all about like a bunch of packages and litter in the rivers, and an Indian, Native American, sitting on the riverbanks crying. Interestingly, though, like, that was played by an Italian actor, so not even a Native American. So it's largely a marketing campaign. 1989. Lots of other small climate summits that happened. Exxon Valdez, this was pretty visceral in my mind, I guess, as I was growing up, because I did see the pictures of birds, all coated in oil and petroleum, and it was quite prolific in my journey into the environmental sciences. But Exxon Valdez in Alaska affected 2,100 kilometers of shoreline. But okay, so this was in 1989. 1978, the International Bird Rescue realized that oil spills and bird and wildlife would be a constant tension. So they actually commissioned Chevron to find actually, it was just $100,000. They commissioned Chevron $100,000 to find the best soap that would clean wildlife. And so if we look into our kitchens, and I even had this as well, because I, back in the US, I would have this because it's Blue Dawn. It helps wildlife. But the irony is that, this is a petroleum-based dish soap packaged in petroleum-based plastic, using oil spills as a marketing tool to sell their product, continuing a positive feedback loop for oil demand. So to be fair, though, like Procter & Gamble of Dawn, have collectively since 1978, 79, donated 500,000 total, whopping, to bird rescues since the study came out. So, but this is a part of the broader trend at consumer deflection. Pay no attention to the man behind the green curtain, because we don't need to really see what's happening. So instead of altering its business model accordingly, it just dug its heels in, right? And by its fossil fuel industry, and decided to fight the facts. So this is when they started rounding up climate contrarians, such as this guy, Fred Singer. He received $5,000 per month from the Heartland Institute. Heartland Institute is the Koch brothers, which is all fossil fuel built. But there's another guy, William Happer. And if you'll recall, there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and he said that carbon dioxide is, quote, a boon to plant life. And he also said that, quote, the demonization of carbon dioxide is like the demonization of the poor Jews under Hitler. So it was already starting, they were paying these experts, quote, experts, to say that fossil fuels are good for the planet and to really give these false analogies and false equivalencies of things in history. So at the same time, there was a push from these groups to lambast the media to say, well, you're only presenting the overwhelmingly scientific consensus, right? Like, even though there was, 97, 98% of the time, what these groups were really pushing were saying, well, you're not giving equal time in the media. So in response, a bunch of the media outlets were now saying, okay, well, we'll have to give equal time to these experts as well as the climate scientists. So it wound up being 50-50-ish. So you've got, 98%, 97% of the climate scientists that said, yes, climate change is real. And then you've got the paid 1 to 3% that it's now getting equal amount of time. So 1990, we have the IPCC, World Climate Conference that came out. This is the first time that the big report came out. And the underlying feeling from the scientists, and this is going to be a complete the trend, and we probably all feel like this, is that the science is clear. Politically, they were too weak and not committing enough. And this is decades ago. And so this is going to be an ongoing theme where scientists say, no, it's not enough. Like, we know what's going on. And the politicians going, okay, well, we'll look into it, but there's no huge commitments and we can't pay for everything, right? So this is going to be a theme. So 92, there's a pronouncement of diplomacy, which is becoming possible because the Cold War is, quote, over. And the subsequent next climate conference was held in Berlin as a symbolic symbol of unity. And so as we have these countries coming together purportedly to say, yes, we're going to have, unity to collectively tackle climate change, it still had the tension of the Cold War, the media, and other types of fossil fuel and dark money coming in to put in the seeds of doubt. So in 1999, we have the infamous hockey stick graph, which came out from led by Michael Mann and many others. And Exxon, especially, pick on Exxon again, is like, no, your science is wrong, even though they had already had their own reports, right? And actually, because this came out and they already had their internal science, they said, no. This they accelerated the disinformation campaign. But more than that, they actually went and targeted individual climate scientists and their families, death threats, careers, things like that. So 2009, there was all sorts of hope with Copenhagen. And Copenhagen was dubbed Copenhagen, yet there's loads of criticism because the visceral images that came out of this were 1,200 limos being with driving individuals to the climate summit, as well as 140 private jets, all just kind of having a traffic jam in the air. And because of this, those images said, it's like, well, why should we actually have to reduce, reuse, recycle when they're making such a larger impact of one person just flying to this climate summit in one private jet? So again, the messaging was quite deliberate, highlighting these disparities. Okay, so 2015, quite a big year. 17 interlinked SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which was a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. And with the Paris Climate Agreement, it was about getting everybody to agree to commit to these targets. It was about agreeing on mitigation, adaptation, and coming up with some finance plans. And under the Paris Climate Agreement, each country, individual country that was party to the Paris Climate Agreement, needed to come up with NDCs, their nationally determined contributions. But so as we're coming together and the world collectively is going, this is a common problem that we need to solve. At the same time, we have one party that was very publicized that pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, But not that this was happening previously, but with the UK and now the US, the trend has been entrenched, right? So internationally, there was this global consensus movement of climate change and the collective need to work together, while at the same time, the fruits of all this particularly striking nationalistic, domestic-centric policies were really coming to the fore. And so, we have, on one hand, individual countries that are hyper-competitive for resources, but at the same time, we said, one planet, we need to work together. And so we've got, around the same time, hyper-nationalistic policies, Brexit, Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro. And at the same time, Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of Exxon, is now Secretary of State. And this isn't by coincidence, this is by design. So COP26, while Paris was seen as getting everybody to agree to the agreement, COP26 was seen as the implementation. Okay, so that's my very quick, here's my very brief history of climate policies. But now we're at present day. So remember, for the past 12 to 10,000 years, we've enjoyed the Holocene. It's been fantastic, marked by relative stable climate. And now the climate is dominated so much by humans that it's anthropogenic activities. So if you look on the left, there's a little bit of an orange bit. That's the Holocene. And it's such a relatively small part. But why is this a big deal? Well, there's two major and interrelated things. So the Holocene, we've got marked by a stable climate, but now we have the atomic bomb. And why is this important? Well, the International Commission on Stratigraphy in 2019 actually officially voted to recognize a new geological epoch. So we are now officially out of the Holocene and into the Anthropocene or Anthropocene, or colloquially known as the radionucleotides or the atomic age. So climate is driven not just by natural processes, but largely human-driven endeavors. Predicated, so like our patterns we can't predict the patterns anymore. It's going to be characterized by more intense, surprising, and larger events, right? And so all of these models and policies that have been developed to actually, not cure climate change, but like solve our wicked problems, is all predicated on these models that were developed in the Holocene and all developed on policies from decades ago where we had some type of science, but it's obviously evolved. And sometimes it's just not up to spec in terms of where the actual realistic models are, realistic models, or where the systems are. So we have kind of fitting a square peg into a round hole at the moment. And a lot of our decision makers are saying, well, can we actually reconcile and approach these extremely complex and wicked problems with the understanding that we need to fundamentally need to think differently, right? And how can we think more systemically, intersectionally, transdisciplinarily? How do we actually do this? And typically, so we've got with wicked problems, there's no definitive solution. There's no independent symptom, or there's no independent variable that we can actually figure out because there's so much intertwined, and there's no actual explanation, no one explanation, right? It's so complex. And so how do we actually do this? Well, typically, how we've actually looked at science is we've approached scientific research questions and challenges from an angle to assess from a very mechanistic approach, right? So the mechanistic procedures worked really fantastically, and still does, obviously, to allow us to get to the core fundamentals of knowledge. But this is what we typically conjure up when we hear of the term academic silos. So we've got, our English and philosophy and math, and but we're stuck in these particular silos. And when we actually look at the nature of wicked problems, we can't have that same game plan to solve our challenges. So, okay, wicked problems, absolutely far more systemic and tangled. And you know what? This is a pretty simplistic wicked problem. It's actually more like this. This is what I think of it. So if we look at like a ball of yarn, gosh, it might be easy to take just like one ball of yarn, like on the left. If it was one black ball of yarn, we can figure it out and work diligently to untangle it. But when I think of wicked problems, it's more like the one on the right. And it's more like a bunch of garbled up balls of yarn where you don't know where one color ends and one color doesn't. And so it doesn't matter. It's so many types of yarn that it's so difficult to even know where to start or how to unravel things. In real life, if we actually want to display it in a model, we look at it more of a scientific approach like this. So this is truly what sketching out the wicked problem looks like. This is for COVID, but there are multiple inputs, and I think of each of the different colors as the silos. And we can see that there's causal inferences and feedback loops, and untangling these wicked problems are really tough because you can pull on one thread, but it might pull on another and cause an unwanted outcome. And so if we think about how we're taught to solve these problems, we want order. We want order because we like order and we can't stand chaos. If things are messy and complex, I don't know about you, but I like to pretend and to not make eye contact with that issue because it's a really challenging thing to actually just understand, and it kind of breaks my brain sometimes. And that's a normal thing. That's a human thing. That is a neurological thing. So it is okay to feel like that. We just have to acknowledge it. And this is especially when we're dealing with wicked problems and multi and cross-scale complex adaptive systems. Right. So we're going to have to realize that when we're going to be in these uncomfortable spaces to find these solutions, and it starts by acknowledging our own limitations of these models and humbling ourselves that to our anthropogenic perspectives that we can solve anything or everything with technology or science, because that's just not always the case. But to solve these problems, what's typically cited as the core characteristics for success. So when you look into it, it's you have to have leadership and you have to have bravery and creativity and innovation. So for us to succeed in to solve these problems, here, when I pull up, like, what do you mean by leadership? This is what it comes up with in the business world, right? So in order to find these creative solutions, we need to great leadership, drives innovation. Here's a simplistic overview of what innovation looks like. But oh my gosh, like, what does this mean? Purpose, looking out, what does this mean? Because innovation also requires creativity. And so when we look up, like, what does this mean? We Google it and we can actually come up with other sorts of word clouds and everything else. And when we get right down to it, all of these things for innovation, it's all basically, fantastic, but what does this mean? All this word cloud jargon that comes up with. And it goes back to breaking down these silos. So let's actually see what each of these particular things mean. And that means going into a science that we might be a little bit uncomfortable with, like, gasp, social science literature. Because in order for us to solve these challenges, we're going to have to understand that you don't just get to these characteristics and understand it from going to Barnes and Noble and going to the self-help section and in the business saying, how can I be innovative? No, we're going to have to get uncomfortable and embrace messiness and other types of science and work with other types of scientists and different types of languages, science languages. And it's going to seem really foreign to us, and it's really uncomfortable. And I use that word a lot because it really is uncomfortable and messy. But this critical causal input for wicked challenges might actually come from sciences that we're not really familiar with, but we have to kind of to work with it, So great. What does the actual social science peer-reviewed literature say about these particular underlying things like leadership, creativity, and innovation? Okay, the answer is very clear. And again, very uncomfortable. I'm still not comfortable with it, but here we go. But this is what the science says. So I'll tell you what it boils down to. And it's going to be, feel a bit prickly in multiple ways, but much like carbon is the building block or the foundational building block for life forms. Here's what the actual data says. The actual data in the social science literature for what we need to accomplish and foster these qualities of leadership, creativity, and innovation in the workplace, if we boil it down, it's going to be vulnerability. And I still don't like it. I still get uncomfortable with it. But this is what ultimately is the foundation. It's the building block of leadership, creativity, and innovation. And that's really that's really counterintuitive for us to hear, because what we've typically learned, or at least what I've learned, is when we think of risk or any type of threat with risk, it's threat plus vulnerability equals risk. And what do we want to do? We want to armor up, we want to protect ourselves, and we want to eliminate any type of threat or vulnerability. And so we think synonymously with vulnerability as weakness. And that's not always the case. So we need to flip that narrative a bit, at least in our own workspaces, because being open, being vulnerable, that shared exchange of openness, it's the most basic building block of cooperation and trust. And I'm not saying be totally open about sharing absolutely everything, like don't do that. But vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. It's fostering the culture for someone to feel comfortable enough to say to a colleague, I just don't understand exactly what this means, or could you help me explain it? Like, I know I'm supposed to be an expert in this, but I'd really like to understand it a little bit more, and I think you could give me a greater perspective. A lot of times we don't want to show those vulnerabilities because we feel like we'll be weak. And it's maybe having to assess what our actual KPIs in the workplace are, because a lot of times we have perfection, and for success, we can't make mistakes, or we can't, if we're not perfect, or the idea doesn't work out, or if there's a failure, you often get dinged. And so what we do is we scale back that innovation, we scale back that creativity, because we play it safe, because we don't want to get dinged on the KPIs, or the success in the workplace. So we don't always throw those pie in the sky ideas out, because it's just not always embraced in the workplace. So to solve these massively wicked, complex problems, right? And there's completely different variables and types of causal loops and dependencies. And we really need to put out the forefront of our thinking of how we're actually going to solve these tough problems. Okay, couple things. One, a 1931 paper. You don't have to go through and read it. This is 1931. It's a pretty dense paper, but the TLDR is basically, this is from a Polish mathematician, physicist, and he basically said a map is not a territory. And I think this is a pretty amazing analogy for when we actually look at all the models and maps and perceptions of the world. They're all just reductions. They're all just reductions for us to understand it, because it breaks our brains and it's too complex for us to really understand. So we humans have to have boundaries for us to understand these particular systems, and that's a limitation. So we need to realize that, fish aren't going to swim from Lake Erie in Ohio over to Canada and go, oh, wait a minute, there's our political boundary, let's go back. So that's just not how nature works, right? So we have to realize that all of our models, no matter how great and complex they might be, they really are just a reduction of the natural science and processes. Okay, last slide. Clearly, we know that we need to do to stop climate change, because now that we've solved it in 45 minutes, all of our wicked problems. And from that bit of a wild ride, I can distill it down to 3 core and interrelated messages. And they're this: recognize path dependencies. Whether it's, why is 10 Downing Street black? Oh, there's a reason for that, but it might be because of these particular things. There's a reason for that. Just be aware of legacy laws and policies. Most of our laws, at least in the US, are based on the 32 Justinian, Roman times Justinian code from thousands of years ago. And so it's so entrenched, and the inertia to even change a law or a policy is entrenched all the way back to that Justinian code. And so, why are they there? Why are we working within these particular systems? Follow the money if we need to. And this gives a really rich context to the problem that we're framing or trying to understand. And so 2, we need to humble ourselves. We like our academic silos because it makes us comfortable. And we like these mechanistic problems to solve, and we like order. And so that's why we distill down and create these simplistic models of trying to order chaos. And so knocking down some of these silos, or at least making some bridges, or creating some bridges, would be really beneficial. It's frustrating. Sometimes it's like learning a new language, or as I like to call myself, a translator. And in between some of these silos, and it's really difficult, and it takes time, and it's not just that let me pull out a dictionary so I can translate this. It could take months or years to get the similarity in languages, to understand what different disciplines are talking about. So, but once you do that, you get interdisciplinary teams, which are needed to solve these wicked challenges. Then that creates multidisciplinarity. But what comes from that is transdisciplinarity. And from transdisciplinarity, you have an emergence of these different types of solutions that come out of this. So, it's the proverbial whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so from there, we've got number 3. Get uncomfortable. I don't mean sit until your legs fall asleep. I mean, don't sit in weird positions, but get creative. For us to get leadership, creativity, and innovation to solve these really complex challenges for our global health and our global well-being, we need to embrace vulnerability. And some of you that might be fostering a culture where people aren't going to get in trouble for asking questions or acknowledging their own limitations or ability. But what this boils down to, ultimately, is a constraint on innovation and solution. No vulnerability, no creativity. No tolerance or lack of tolerance for failure means no innovation. So if we actually look at what the science says, we need to foster this type of culture for us to have these great ideas to solve our wicked challenges. So with that, I will end there. And Vic, there's probably some questions in the text, but I'm happy to answer anything, and I'm happy to go over time because I realized it's coming up on time.
Thanks, Kelly. I found that to be very enlightening. Awesome talk. Thanks for that. So science background and innovation knowledge drop right there. So please do post your questions in the chat, and I will read them out. Let me see. I don't see any yet.
That's good. That means that everyone's gonna solve everything all at once. So well done.
I see some
we
comments.
Solved the world problems.
The Big Fat Climate Report was appreciated. Best animation ever, Gary says. Karen says the black line was alarming on that chart. So Karen Willand has a question. What should be someone's first step if new to this approach?
New to what approach? New to, I guess,
I'm guessing she's talking about the wicked solving or identifying wicked problems and where to start.
Where to start? Oh, well, that's a question, isn't it? So I feel like I guess I'm going to give you a very scientific answer, and I guess it depends on what you do. But for me, it starts internally, and it's realizing that we can't do everything all at once. We can't save the entire world, but we can do something, right? And to understand what it takes to actually solve these problems, for me, it was doing a lot of internal work and saying, I don't know everything, and I'm going to be okay with asking questions to people, even though I'm supposed to be an expert sometimes, and maybe I don't know, or I need somebody to bounce ideas or riff ideas off of. But ultimately, it's having the courage, which comes from vulnerability, to be able to speak up and ask these things, because ultimately, if you don't, okay, so I'll digress slightly. My whole ethos is, when I have a daughter, if she comes to me and says, okay, mom, what did you do, in your lifetime to solve the climate process or climate challenges? I'm going to go, you know what? I was brave and I had courage and this is what I did. And sometimes it's really uncomfortable, but I did X, Y, Z. I'm going to have answers. And I don't want to get to the end of my life and say I have any regrets that, like, kind of wish I would have spoken up because I didn't really know or grasp that particular concept in that meeting. And I think I really could have contributed to it. And so for me, I think about that every day when I go into meetings, when I think about papers that I'm writing with research. It's uncomfortable, and I say that a lot. And I humble myself and just go, you know what? I'm just going to ask. I'm going to ask, and I don't want to get to the end of my life and say, do I have regrets? And so whatever that means for you, in whatever position you're in, I think that's a good question to ask.
Thanks, Kelly. Yep. So there's another question in the chat from Anna. So who has begun to take or is taking the right steps in this direction, solving wicked problems? Are there any major players that you're aware of that are in this space?
Okay, I'm going to give a shout out to my center, the National University of Singapore, Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. And I don't just say that because I'm here. I was quite picky when I chose a position. I didn't want to be in a silo. I wanted to have interdisciplinarity, and I wanted to be able to go to a place that was cross-scale, intersectional, multidisciplinary, and ultimately transdisciplinary. And so I think what we need to do is find these particular centers that are breaking down or actively breaking down the silos. Not just that, we actually actively look for diversity. So we have about 50-50 gender equity as well, and so we have a bunch. I don't know how many different nationalities. We have a bunch of different nationalities, gender parity, and what it's done is fostered a really great collaborative approach for science, that we can come together and just cross-pollinate in a way. And so I think it takes a concerted effort from the people at the top, like our PI, our center PI, Dr. Kolian Pin, fostered this because he knew that this is what it would take to actually solve some of these wicked challenges.
Good. Thanks, Kelly. As a couple of minutes, I had a comment and a question. One of them, so it seems like there were two things from your talk. One of them is that very often the wicked impacts of a particular industry may be known to that industry well ahead of time, but not spread out through the ecosystem. And then the second one, which I guess follows from that, is in the general public, the awareness of, let's say, an impact or a topic that we should be discussing or should be addressing has its roots maybe several decades in the past, and we might. So there's almost a phase lag, and so the question is, how do you use that knowledge to project forward and say, what should I be working on 20 years from now that, let's say, like with the aviation industry or something like that, right? So what are the kinds of things that we should be looking at 20 years from now? Even though most of the politics and the social dialogue is about, let's say, emissions, climate change. So it seems like that's the there's two trends that are fighting each other. One is that maybe the industry already knows the answer, and two, that not everyone else doesn't.
Yeah. So there's a hysteresis in terms of being able to understand some of these, or when some of these entrenched policies or legacy pathways actually come to fruition, and that's especially pertinent or poignant with money. And when you really look at the politics of climate policies, it goes back, absolutely decades, which is when the seeds are planted and it just proliferates. And so for me, it's not an easy answer, but you have to understand, if you don't have that context of understanding that, wait a minute, there's a hysteresis in terms of where this is actually coming from. then it's not going to be, you're not going to have the bigger picture. You're not going to have a complete picture or an understanding. And when you actually look at these systems, and I just saw somebody put Santa Fe Institute up there, which is awesome. They have really great programs, but you can't really look at it and understand it without that context of, wait a minute, maybe there's some deeper systemic issues or some roots that have actually begun. So even though I'm looking at particular variables of the system in this present day, there's actually deeper roots, and what is a result of that, and where does that come from? That's how I look at it, because ultimately you can't untangle that, the ball of yarn. You can't really untangle all of it, but you can at least understand that, wait a minute, this is coming from a deeper approach from over here or over here, and it gives you a greater clarity, at least, even though it's still very messy. For me, I like to have that context, mainly because it helps me understand the bigger picture.
Thanks, Kelly. And I think we're at the top of the hour. So I'd like to thank you again for talking with us and for staying up really late to, to share your knowledge with us. Thanks again. Thanks everyone for attending the Cast Brown Bag.
Thanks.
Bye all.
Hope you enjoyed your lunch. It's 2 a.m. here. I'm gonna head to bed. Thanks, Vic. Good to see you.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
Thank you.